Thank you, Joe. So I get the post-lunch peak food coma slot. I will try, therefore, to keep this fairly energized and keep you awake as much as I can. I will also try not to bellow at you because I am ex-military and I've been blown up twice. Once is unhelpful, twice is frankly careless. But what it means is I tend to shout quite loudly. My daughter says she always knows when I'm in the house, and she knows I'm definitely in the house and not wearing my hearing aids when they come on. And change and empowerment of change, in the military context is maybe a bit of an anathema to some of you. You're sort of sitting there and thinking, well, surely in the military, I used to walk around with a badge on, bark orders at people, and they had to do what I said, and I had to do whatever I was told to do as well. But actually, the military can't work like that because you've got people out on the ground doing all sorts of stuff that, as leaders, you can't possibly know about all the time. And at one point in my career, and towards the end of my career, I found myself being the head of strategy on Afghanistan to David Cameron when he was the Prime Minister in 2010. I'd just come out of 6 months serving in Afghanistan, arrived in this job, and 3 weeks into the job, he stood up in Parliament and announced that the UK was going to have all of its combat troops and all of its equipment out of Afghanistan in the next 2 years. At which point, everybody starts to look around, me included, as to who is going to have to lead this epic thing, only to find I was a room of one, and it was me. So there I am trying to work out how do you get 11,000 people out of Afghanistan back to the UK. And I had this really pernicious problem that I found extremely challenging to deal with. And it was probably, I'd say this role was probably the most challenging leadership role that I'd ever had in the military. Because when we looked at the equipment that was coming out, there's nearly 20,000 shipping containers worth of equipment that had to come back. And when we looked at the bandwidth, if you like, of the logistics routes that we could bring stuff back on, it was going to take us 18 months, best effort, with no problems, no issues at all to get all this equipment back. And we only had 2 years. That's now only 6 months faff factor. So that means you've now got to start taking out equipment from day one. So I'm left with this really rather unwelcome psychological issue to deal with of I'm going to be drawing people out, so there's a population left there who are decreasing and decreasing and decreasing, but they're all at an increasing level of personal risk because I'm taking out the equipment at the same time that's protecting them. And therefore, the only way in this can really work is to allow people to make their own decisions. And in the military, we call it putting the authority where the information is. Putting the authority where the information is. What you don't want in any organization going through change or anything else like that is somebody sitting there and going, I've seen this, what do I do? 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 Do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, right? It's too slow. We've missed the opportunity and, we need to move on. So the military empower people through a technique we've often called freedom in a framework, where essentially you provide some risk tolerances and you allow people to make their own choices. So I, sitting in Whitehall, would come up with a plan that a particular type of vehicle would come back on a particular day, and we would draw all of that vehicle out. I'd then go out to Afghanistan to a certain base to do a visit to find that vehicle still driving around, right? And in the military, we call that consent and evade. I'm going to agree to what you've told me to do and then ignore you and carry on and do what I think is right, all right? And it is about this empowerment. So those bases are basically saying, look, this particular type of vehicle for us in this area is much more useful than a different type of vehicle. So rather than send that vehicle back in the future, I'm going to send it back now and keep the one that I want. So I'm just doing a one-for-one swap. And that became for me quite an interesting learning phase as to how to go about change. So 12 years ago, I left the military and started to do this consultancy work. And one of the first pieces of work we had was supporting Drax Power Station, going through a massive change and transformation program. So this was in 2020, and they were shifting from coal burning to biomass. They also had government subsidies stopping in 2027. So they had to become more efficient, more effective as an organization to survive, in the future without the subsidies. So they were going to lose nearly a third of their workforce. They were also having to shift to be more cost effective by using contractors in the evenings and at night times and at weekends rather than their own team, and having overtime because it is more cost effective. So you've got this massive challenge in a very traditional, long time served, quite unionized industry. A lot of people been in the organization 30 plus years, and you're trying to work out how to go about this. And I was put under the pressure on my very first day going in there, when it being very Yorkshire. I don't know if you've got any Yorkshire people in the room. Forgive me if we have, hands going up. I walk in and the very first person I meet goes, "Are you any good?" And you're like, okay, all right, this is what we're dealing with. And essentially what we did with this process was very similar to what I set out in that Afghan example, where we got the senior leadership team to set out the what and the why, but leave the teams to come up with the how. So when we were looking at the what and the why and defining that what and why, we did a bit of gaming around it, and there was a fantastic talk this morning about gaming and gamification. And we realized there were 6 reasons as to why this would fail if we were trying to achieve success. So those become the things you focus on, right? And the 6 things that we needed to look at and focus on were things like coordination, breaking down those interdepartmental boundaries, improving the way in which the situational awareness is going on within the organization. So people are talking to each other more across those silos. Familiar phrase that we heard this morning with Perry. There were things around how they execute the work, because they had issues where scaffolding was going up at one part of the plant. Some work was being done on that particular part. Scaffolding would come down, and then 2 days later, scaffolding would go back up at exactly the same place for a different team to do a different job on the same thing, right? So how do we get much better at that? How do we become more empowered, pushing the authority down to the information so people feel more comfortable to make decisions? And the way in which they went about it was to create transformation teams for each one of these 6 factors. So they created 6 teams of 11 people. So now all of a sudden you've got 66 people involved, some of whom are apprentices, some of whom are union reps, some of whom are mid-managers. And they had, within each team of 11, a blend from across all the different departments in the business. And they then are free, as Perry was talking about this morning, to use their imagination, right? How would you want to fix this? And as Jo said in her introduction, very first introduction this morning, so that this isn't change being foisted on you, this is you designing the change yourselves. First thing that happened, being very Yorkshire, yeah, you're just trying to consult us and pretend, aren't you? Just tell us what's actually going to happen, right? We don't believe you, essentially. They didn't believe that the senior leadership team were willing to give all these teams of people the opportunity to create the change themselves. Second issue, I am far too busy for this. I can't possibly find enough time to do these workshops, go through the design of what we're going to go and do and how we go about it. So overcoming those initial hurdles was quite a challenge, but I don't know how many of you work with John Cotter's work, 8 Levers of Change. Yeah, there's some people nodding. All right. Second lever of change is a powerful coalition. And this is essentially what Drax created through these 6 transformation teams. at a future population, employment population of 400, with a steering group plus these teams, they've got nearly 80 odd people involved, 66 people in the transformation teams and a steering group. So nearly a quarter of the organization is involved. And then you'll get people say to me, well, that sounds great, and it's really consultative, and I can see how it works, getting them to come up with a how so they own it, but isn't that like really slow? Well, not as slow as trying to drive change top down. Actually, by doing this sort of thing, you really get, the imagination coming out. But what you also get, interestingly, is you get a boundaryless organization. I had no idea when Perry was doing his speech this morning that this would tie in so nicely, because what they found was that within each of these teams and across the 6 teams, relationships were building up, and they were building up between people who ordinarily wouldn't talk to one another or know much about each other. So now you've got an organization where instead of them sitting there and going, well, we can't do anything because Department X hasn't delivered us something, they just pick the phone up and go, hi, Jen, it's Chris. Can you just give me a feel for this? Or can you get this to me? And all of a sudden, they started to achieve in a day what used to take them a week and a half, purely through that boundaryless organization, that build-up of connections across the organization. And deliberately difficult to read slide for obvious reasons, right? But they produced a change plan. What became really interesting was that all of the people in that group of 66 that had been told, once you come up with the plan, you can then step out of this project and we'll have other people come in and implement it and run with the implementation because you're giving up a lot of your time. So all these people who'd said initially, I haven't got time for this, you get to this point and go, thanks very much, you've defined the end state, we know what's going to happen, now you can stop. All hell breaks loose, right? Because they're like, no, you can't take me off this. Only I understand it. Only I've put it together. I know how this all works. So they didn't want to be taken back off the program. So you've got that connection and that ownership. And I think the success that came of it, though, was through culture. It was through the leadership team, the senior leadership team at Drax being willing to allow the teams to come up with the how. It was about pushing back each time when they were saying, just tell us the answer. We know you've got the answers. Like, no, we don't. We want you to come up with the answers. We want you to help with this. And in going through the process, all of these individuals, these 66 individuals, are building up new skills, right? They're building up new management techniques, learning about how to collate information, learning about how to produce options out of that information, how to choose one of the options and score them, how to build a campaign plan like the one up on the screen. So they're all being upskilled, but it comes down to that leadership and that culture. And there's a poll on your app at the moment as to how empowered do you feel your organization is and how good is it at doing it. So we'll take the results at the end, and Joe can have a look at the results right at the end. But yeah, if you could have a look at that poll for me. Okay, sorry, thanks, Joe.
And click on this session, and then click on the banner that says live discussion, and then you'll find a tab that says chat, questions, or poll, and it's the poll that you want. So it might take a little time to just wend its way through to you. So keep trying, and then do it by the end, and we'll be able to share it. Okay. So go to the agenda. This session, live discussion. Thanks, Chris.
No problem. Thanks, Joe. And this is what it comes down to for me, right? If you want people to really connect with things, you've got to involve them. It's not about just telling people, with, briefings or whatever else it might be, town halls, email campaigns, glossy words like Janet was talking about. Actually get people involved. But sometimes it doesn't work, and it doesn't work because of culture. So let me take you into a slightly different scenario, where an organization that I won't mention, because I'm going to show some results in a minute up on the screen about them, came along and they were like, we want to empower our people. And we keep telling our people that they are empowered. We keep telling them that they've got the right to make decisions and make choices, right? And they're just still not doing it. And we're growing really fast as an organization, so we're getting bottlenecks now where everybody's still coming to the same leaders over and over again rather than going out to everybody. And we're like, okay, well, let's have a look at your organization. And lots of you will be familiar with these tools, so I won't labor them, the description of them. But essentially, you've got Cameron and Quinn's Competing Values Framework, or the OCAI. How many people are familiar with it? Okay, not that many. All right. Very briefly then, essentially, organizational differences from being very flexible to very controlling, and very internally focused to externally focused. And what you have then is 4 quadrants, all right? You've got a creativity quadrant where everything is about new products, new services, new techniques. That's what drives people. That's what people love being in the organization for. Directly opposite that, you've got control, okay? Structure, process, policies, procedures. And top left, you've got collaborative, so very sort of nurturing family type of organization, opposed by competition and how the competition comes in, hitting numbers, getting out there, doing all sorts of stuff. And for me, the thing that's important with this is then you layer on a separate technique. So I'm a big fan of Matthew Said's work. Don't know how many of you read Rebel Ideas about the power of diverse thinking. And he talks about the importance of having multiple tools that you overlap, because it's like a zone of accuracy for each tool. And because they're not perfectly aligned, if you start to layer them up, that zone of accuracy gets smaller and smaller, that you can thread through all of them. So using path goal theory with the different leadership types of empowering or directive or anything else like that, it starts to give you quite an interesting perspective of the culture and the leadership and how the leadership is affecting the culture. And when we started to look at the results for this organization, essentially what you had was, this was the shape that you get for the overall organization, all right? So they are a really quite collaborative, nurturing, family feel to the organization. That's what they believed, okay? And that's what they feel, that's what they recognize. That's the way things are around here. But what becomes interesting is, as Perry was talking about this morning, you don't have just a monoculture like that, right? And when you start to pull out either by department or by tenure in the business or by seniority, in this case, the senior leadership team, you can start to get some very different results. And in purple is the senior leadership team's culture. So it's very different to the majority of the organization. You've got leadership who are all about new products, new services, go, 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 and an organization that's going, no, but we're really family orientated. And you want to become empowered, but when you look at the scores, the strongest score came out with directive leadership. Do as I say. Do as I say now. Do it in this way. So you've got a leadership with a different culture to the rest of the organization, trying to make the organization more empowered, but leading in a way that is the direct opposite of empowerment. And that's why these things, weren't working and weren't coming through. So, interesting stuff, I think, in the way that you can look at these different examples. One that went really, really well because of the way that the leadership were looking at it. They were looking at how do you lead change. They were learning about how you lead change and allowed the teams to come up with the how. And another organization that is not doing those behaviors that we heard earlier on and we heard in that very last panel session that comes through. I'm afraid I've run out of time for questions, but I am still around for the rest of the day. Downstairs there's a little Quirk stand. Please do come along and bellow at me if it's a busy, noisy room, because otherwise I will be staring at your teeth. I am sorry. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you to the 62 people that voted. Well done. And I don't know whether this is norm for what you'd expect, Chris, but we had 4% said their organisation was really poor at empowering people to make decisions. 6% thought their organisation was amazing. 22% not great. 24% pretty good. But by far the biggest vote was for fairly average.
Wow, there we
So.
go. Well, I hope then that the talk that I've just given is a bit of support to the people who are very average. Thanks very much.
I'm sure it has been. Thank you.